I'm Ben Grapevine, and this is The Grapevine. Let's go back to September of 2008. For months, Americans have been overwhelmed with sound bites, debate quotes, and campaign speeches from Senators Barack Obama and John McCain. But if there's any singular audio clip that comes to mind when you think back to the 2008 election season, there's a good chance it's this.
And I can see Russia from my house.
That's comedian Tina Fey and her satirical impression of vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. It's an impression she performed frequently on Saturday Night Live at the height of the election season. Fey's impression was well received and resoundingly successful, at least in part due to its relative accuracy. Political slant aside, Fey looked just like Palin, and more importantly to this piece, she sounded just like her too. Now, Palin never directly made this same claim, but she did say this in an ABC News interview with Charlie Gibson.
They're our next door neighbors, and you can actually see Russia from land here in Alaska.
So while being able to see Russia from her house is use of comedic license on Fey's part, we can tell the voice is remarkably similar. It's not perfect, but it's a talented replication. Fey's impression of Palin would continue as a cornerstone of SNL's cold open up until the actual election. And while I could spend an entire podcast demonstrating what's so good about it, this isn't an episode about Tina Fey or Sarah Palin. Instead, I want to talk about the accent they shared and why I think it's one of the most interesting in the United States. This accent is, to me, fascinating, and it's not one we hear often. Alaska only has a population of about 739,000, but even in the last frontier, it's not widespread. Now, uninterested listeners may be quick to pass it off as an offshoot of a Canadian accent or a natural regional dialect, but that's not quite it. At the height of the 2008 election, I was 13, so I didn't think much of it either. Now that I'm 10 years older and a proud Minnesotan convert, though, it piqued my interest for one key reason. It sounds remarkably Minnesotan. Maybe you'd compare it to something out of Wisconsin or Michigan. There's a reason some born and raised Alaskans sound like they're straight out of the upper Midwest, but to understand it, we'll have to go a little over 80 years back to 1934. The United States is 5 years into the throes of the Great Depression, and throughout the country, people are struggling to survive and maintain their ways of life. Radiating from Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program is built to revitalize the country through sweeping policy changes and active government assistance in nearly all areas of economic and civil life. The program, or set of programs, focused on relief, recovery, and reform, and would become one of the largest applications of government assistance in American history. While New Deal programs elsewhere aimed to raise the national employment rate and revitalize communities, a significant portion of the early New Deal's provisions were built with the aim of re-energizing the agricultural heart of the country. Government programs focused on agricultural growth included subsidies for farmers and food stamps for consumers. But the New Deal's agricultural relief effort also created the Resettlement Administration, a new federal agency built to relocate farm families to new, government-planned communities. In pursuit of its goal to relieve farm families, the Resettlement Administration built new agricultural communities all over the United States, from New Jersey to California and Alabama to Wisconsin. These new communities were designed to make use of underutilized land and to move existing farmers from overfarmed regions with depleted soil to more fertile, untapped fields. In designing these farm towns, the Resettlement Administration searched all over the United States, hoping to maximize its potential. Throughout its short lifespan, the administration would create hundreds of settlements, including one in the Matanuska Valley of Alaska. Now, Alaska isn't an agricultural state. Being the northernmost of the United States, most of Alaska's otherwise viable farmland is either covered by glaciers or plagued by permafrost, ground that remains frozen throughout the entire year. While much of its land is either permanently frozen or otherwise unfeasible for farming, Alaska did have a limited amount of land that the Resettlement Administration saw as open to agricultural use, but with no one currently making use of it. To be fair, at the time there wasn't much of any industry going on in the last frontier, with the state's population being around 60,000 in 1933. Regardless, the administration saw Alaska's Matanuska Valley as underutilized land and sought to realize its potential by creating the state's first New Deal settlement. The center of the Matanuska Valley colony was Palmer, a planned town about 13 miles east of Wasilla and around 40 miles northeast of Anchorage. Founded on the western bank of the Matanuska River, early buildings and community establishments were built mostly by transient workers from California. These workers were housed and provided for during the early stages of the Matanuska Valley project, but the Resettlement Administration had little interest in allowing them to settle here. These new communities were volatile and prone to abandonment, and while agriculture would be theoretically possible in the Matanuska Valley, it wasn't going to be easy. For the task at hand, the administration wanted settlers accustomed to the sort of weather they'd experience in Alaska. California was relatively close to the state via the Pacific, but the colony's designers worried migrants from the Golden State would leave as soon as winter fell. The administration elected to pull prospective candidates from only 3 states: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. The eventual settlers were selected by lottery, and in 1933, somewhere around 200 families from the 3 chosen states made their way to new homes in Alaska. Trained in the analogous upper Midwest, these families arrived in Matanuska ready to establish a powerful agricultural legacy that would last a century. Okay, not quite. While the hardy Northerners were better prepared to deal with the cold weather and blizzards, they weren't ready for the obstacle of the Alaskan soil. Early surveyors speculated that the Matanuska Valley would be the most farmable region in the state, and they were right, but being the most fertile valley in an infertile state isn't saying much. It wasn't impossible to farm in Matanuska, but the depression-worn settlers were looking for a break, not a new challenge. Around 200 families moved to the Matanuska Valley to start anew, but according to The Economist, barely a decade after they'd arrived, most had abandoned their farms completely, and the project was largely seen as a failure. Though the Matanuska Valley colony failed, its mark on the valley and surrounding region remains today. The Resettlement Administration may not have kickstarted a major agricultural effort in Alaska. Even today, the state only has around 500 farms, but most of those are located in the Matanuska Valley. Today, the valley is part of the Matanuska-Susitna Borough of Alaska. Alaska is one of only 2 states not to use counties, calling its subdivisions boroughs instead. The other one's Louisiana and its parishes. The borough, known as the Mat-Su to locals, has a population of about 106,000 and is considered part of the Anchorage metro area. The administrative seat of the borough is Palmer, where the resettlement project began, and it's also the site of the yearly Alaska State Fair, which draws between 250 and 300,000 people from across Alaska and beyond to the town of 7,200. The first fair, held in 1936, was put on by the Matanuska colonists, and except for a 5-year hiatus during World War II, it's gone on successfully ever since. The Matanuska Valley colony didn't make way for an agricultural revolution in the last frontier, and it's not difficult to see why such an effort would have failed, but to project that failure onto the rest of the valley is to make a mistake. According to The Economist, only 5% of the food consumed in Alaska is produced locally versus 81% nationwide. But since the 1930s, Palmer and the Mat-Su Valley have only grown. According to the City of Palmer's website, in less than 20 years, the heart of the Matanuska Valley has transformed from a peaceful rural area to a rural bedroom community, and most recently, to an increasingly self-sufficient commercial employment center. And while most of the Midwestern settlers left their farms, there's no telling how many of them stayed in Alaska. Some stayed, some left, but that accent we still hear, that's distinctly theirs. Today, the residents of Palmer, Wasilla, and the Mat-Su Valley may not be able to see Russia from their houses, but are they here to stay? You betcha. The Grapevine is written and produced by me, Ben Grapevine. Special thanks to The Economist for their piece, Growing Farmers, to Slate magazine for What Kind of Accent Does Alaska Have?, Building a Town by James H. Fox and the Palmer Historical Society, and some additional reference pieces from the University of Wisconsin and the City of Palmer. Thanks as always to those of you who have supported and who continue to support the podcast. I've got a long list of stories I want to tell, and I can't wait for you to hear them. Until then, you can find me on Twitter at BenGrapevine or through my website, bengrapevine.com. As always, thanks for listening.